Hi, my name's Benji, and welcome to Dice vs Cards. Today we're bringing you an OCD Modern Deck Tech. So why OCD, you ask? Well, I find myself each and every time I build a deck that I place artificial rules and limitations on what's allowed. Sometimes in the pursuit of theme, sometimes just because of some strange compulsion, but always in pursuit of having the most fun playing the game, just like Johnny or Timmy would. However, it would be remiss of me not to give a nod to the spikes out there by retaining as much of a deck's competitiveness as possible. So let me ask you, do you like strangling your opponents of resources and watching them try and find their way out of an increasingly bleak situation? Do you like role-playing torture and torment? Then we're here with a deck for you. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Eco-Friendly 8-Rack. This deck specialises in discarding your opponent's hand and sitting back whilst your rack engine relentlessly dwindles your opponent's life total to zero. So we start our journey today with the plan. So we start proceedings with a playset of this deck's namesake, the rack. First printed way back in antiquities, this card punishes your opponent for casting or doing anything to excess. Once this thing gets going, it's going to be death by 1,000 cuts. Quickly following this up, we're bringing 4 copies of its younger sibling, Shrieking Affliction, to complete the octet of rack effects. This brings a slightly different triggered ability to proceedings, but still brings the same level of hurt. Next up is a playset of... Wait a second, who let this guy in here? Mr. Shortfang, I've explained this to you before. This is not a 12 rack deck. You're far too weak and unpredictable to be trusted to do a job here. Even Johnny doesn't want you, so please run along. We then need a way to help relieve your opponents of cards, and so we're bringing a playset of Raven's Crime. Seems simple enough. 1 mana, you lose a card. Fair's fair after all, but the retraceability makes this an exceptionally strong card and an easy choice. Next up is our suite of targeted discard cards. We're bringing 4 copies of the all-powerful Thoughtseize. It's all well and good letting your opponent choose what card to discard, but why not take your pick? The price? 1 mana, 2 life, aka not much at all. Its cousin is up next as we're bringing a playset of Inquisition of Kozilek, a card similar to Thoughtseize that's a perfect fit for the modern format. We then bring in 4 copies of an instant speed toolkit card in the form of Funeral Charm, another oldie but a goodie. This can help strangle your opponent's draw step, but can also on occasion get rid of any number of dorks your opponent might be bringing to the table. Next up is one of my favourites, a playset of Smallpox, or as I like to call it, the Starving Your Opponent of Oxygen card. This spell resolving is just an awful feeling for your opponent, as the downside for you is nigh on always going to be a darn sight less painful than theirs. As we edge towards the end of our list of spells, it's time to talk about why we're bringing 4 copies of Liliana of the Vow. Right, now that that's done, we're bringing... No, all joking aside, this tier 1 version of Liliana does everything we could need a Planeswalker in this deck to do. And although it ramps up the cost of the deck significantly, she's just too good to leave at home. Now it's time for Johnny's card of the day. Yes, of course we're talking about a playset of Waste Not. What else? Yes, this is too slow and most often going to give your opponent the choice of which resource you get, but Johnny had the final say and so it remains. Alas, there are only 4 spaces left for non-land cards, and that space on this day goes to Fatal Push. Our only targeted removal that's going to reliably do a job for you whilst you set up the rest of your game plan. So that's the bulk of the main deck out of the way. What lands are we bringing? So this is the modern format. You have to bring fetch lands, right? Well, yes, but this playset of Marsh Flats is by no means a must-have. However, the deck filtering this brings, and the option to trigger Revolt for Fatal Push, means that this does deserve a home here. Now this is a deck that wins through consistent chip damage, but every little helps, right? In that spirit, we're bringing 4 copies of Mutavault, the good old go-to colourless manland. Because most of your game plan is to keep the coast clear, And as the game goes on, quite often we have nothing to cast, so we need something to do with our mana, right? Sometimes a measly 2 or 4 damage is the difference between winning and losing. This might not have been a must pick though, if it weren't for this next card. Another playset in the form of Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. If you already have one of these on the battlefield, fine, use it with the retraceability on Raven's Crime. Stuck with only a Mutavault on the battlefield and you need black mana, this solves that problem too. Now for Johnny's challenge of the day. Take this deck, sit down and play a game with an opponent, place an Urborg on the battlefield. Then after creating a zombie from Waste Not, you cast Funeral Charm on it, making it unblockable. Now you've created an unbelievably expensive, unblockable 2-power creature for 1 turn only. But most of all, you've done it with a great deal of panache and style. Job done. Anywho, back to reality. We have 8 spaces left for basic lands. And you guessed it, we're bringing 8 of those most excellent swamps. The detailed and complex reasoning behind bringing these is... Oh, shut up, Benji, with your waffling. So that's the 60 card main deck. What could we possibly consider for the sideboard? So the whole point of a sideboard is to tweak your deck to better combat the metagame at whatever level or wherever you're playing Magic. So in that spirit, whilst I'm going to give you a graphical overlay of how many of each card I think will bring good all-round options to combat any given meta, I'm not going to talk about these quantities in efforts to encourage you to assess the metagame wherever it is you play and build a sideboard accordingly. First up is Nihil Spellbomb, a tier 1 graveyard hate card that was born to be played in mono black decks. If you need to board this in, you're going to be getting exceptional value from it. We then talk about Surgical Extraction. A great many number of decks rely quite heavily on 1 or 2 cards, and they don't always care whether they're in the graveyard or not, so this is going to come in handy on a great number of occasions. Collective Brutality is a toolkit card that can give you solid value if you're able to hit 2 birds with 1 stone with this. Otherwise, you're probably going to have better cards in your main board that will do a similar job. Ratchet Bomb targets all permanents, so there are any number of reasons why this might need to be boarded in, and with so many cards with CMC 1 or 2 in the format, there's going to be very little effort required to get value from this. Bontu's Last Reckoning has a considerable downside, but if your opponent overcommits on board, then this is going to provide a devastating blow to their chances of success. Next up is Dismember. This deals almost flawlessly with sizable creatures. However, even if it doesn't outright deal with something, it can still slow down the clock against you. Finally, Ensnaring Bridge doesn't care if your opponent's creatures are resilient to being destroyed or that they have haste. It just doesn't discriminate. It's a card that will not allow creatures to pass unless your opponent has brought some artifact removal along to deal with it. So that's it for our 75 cards, but before I go I wanted to provide you with some viable budget options, as this deck is certainly now on the rather expensive side. So starting with the most expensive card, Liliana of the Veil. Although it's an absolute all-star in this deck, it has a price that's commensurate with that power level, and unfortunately there are no real like-for-like replacements. However, if you're after more discard, then I'd take Blackmail, or Wrench Mind in this spot. But if it's more removal you need, then bring the Dismembers in from the cold and replace their sideboard slots with something else. Then the most obvious place to bring down the price further, if you need to, is just to bring Swamps as your land base. This will allow you to save on the Marsh Flats, Mutavaults and Urborgs while sacrificing an acceptable level of power. Unfortunately, there's even some expensive cards in the sideboard, like Surgical Extraction and Ensnaring Bridge, so here's some more suggestions for other sideboard possibilities. So there you have it. It seems that this is mostly Johnny's version of an 8-rec deck, but it's a great deal of fun to play, and it definitely brings something a little different to the table. So that's it from me. I'll see you next time.